Hi there. This is the second episode of Ukraine Talks, a weekly podcast by Euromaidan Press, in which two Kyiv-based Ukrainian journalists, Ivan Verstyuk and Serge Havrylets, discuss the latest developments in and around Ukraine and try to give you a bigger picture of what's going on. Before we dive into the topics we want to talk about in more detail, let's first briefly summarize what happened over the past week. Volodymyr Zelensky and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz signed a bilateral security agreement between Ukraine and Germany. In his interview with a Russian journalist, President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, said he only regrets not invading Ukraine sooner. Russia likely used a North Korean KN-23 long-range ballistic missile during its massive missile attack on Ukraine on February 15. Russian forces continue to advance in and around Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast in eastern Ukraine. Ukrainian long-range kamikaze drones continued methodical attacks on the Russian oil refineries that provide fuel for the Russian army, striking an oil depot in Kursk in the western part of Russia. As Russia's oil and gas experts rake in billions for the war effort, Ukraine's expanding drone program takes aim at Russian strategic facilities. Ukraine used a Swedish-American ground-launched small-diameter bomb, GLSDB, on the Eastern Front for the first time in human history. The World Bank and Ukraine's Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal estimated Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery costs at $486 billion over the next decade. 79 Ukrainian journalists were killed in a full-scale Russian invasion, according to the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. Ukraine created coalitions on air defense and drones with international partners to strengthen the country's defense capabilities during the 19th meeting of defense ministers from over 50 countries within the framework of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in the Ramstein format. On February 14, Ukrainian naval kamikaze drones destroyed the Russian landing ship Cesar Kunnikov near the occupied Crimea in southern Ukraine. It is the fourth landing ship from Russia's Black Sea Fleet that the Ukrainian military destroyed since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Russia started to use Tsirkon hypersonic naval missiles against Ukrainian cities. According to Ukraine's intelligence, Russia buys Starlink terminals in Arab countries to support its war effort. Russia is preparing to launch nuclear weapons in space, according to U.S. intelligence sources. The Democratic-led U.S. Senate overcame a key hurdle by passing President Joe Biden's $95 billion foreign aid proposal, including $61 billion for Ukraine. The U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson said he would not pass the Senate bill that offers military support to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan unless it includes measures to deal with the migration issue on the U.S. border. Mike Johnson adjourned the House of Representatives for a 2-week recess without putting the Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan aid bill to a vote. All votes in the House of Representatives, including on aid to Ukraine, are postponed until February 28. Russian opposition leader and Vladimir Putin critic Alexei Navalny has died in prison in Russia. He was 47 years old. Ivan, what do you think about Alexei Navalny's death?
I think this is a milestone for Russia because Navalny was known by everyone in Russia. He was supported by a minority of those Russians who are critical of Vladimir Putin regime. But Navalny is like the biggest figure of Russian opposition. And hopefully, as Russian opposition has been lacking leadership for past 3 years after Navalny was imprisoned, now this job is vacant. And it's very timely for the Russian anti-Putin opposition to gain a new leader who would be doing at least something, because behind the prison bars, Navalny couldn't do anything. So my forecast goes that his wife, Yulia Navalny, will inherit this job and status of key Russian opposition leader from her husband. She is liked by many, and today she delivered a speech in Munich, where this big security conference is taking place. She made a very strong anti-Putin statement there, um, and what I would add is another reason why I think this death of Alexei Navalny in prison in Russia's Arctic region it could be a milestone. It could change the Western assessment of the Putin regime. Let me quote you German Chancellor Olaf Scholz on this. I'll quote his tweet he wrote. I'm deeply saddened by the death of Alexei Navalny. He stood up for democracy and freedom in Russia and apparently paid for his courage with his life. This terrible news shows once again how Russia has changed and what kind of regime is in power in Moscow. End of quote. What the word I would emphasize in this tweet is how Russia has changed. This means that the West, in particular the German Chancellor, admit that Russia is now recognized as a more aggressive, more toxic, more totalitarian state entity than what it was even on February 24th, 2022, when Russian tanks were crossing Ukrainian borders. So I think that the Western strategy on Russia might shift from preventing further acts of Russian aggression to destroying Vladimir Putin's regime. And now I also add another argument for this. Once before the war started, I had a conversation, an interview with Michael McFaul. He used to serve as U.S. ambassador to Moscow. And then I put him a question. Mike, tell me why the U.S. sanctions against Russia for its violence and aggression against Ukraine in 2014, 2015 are so weak. McFaul told me, well, our goal is not destroying Russia, but weakening Russia. And now this might change when Western strategy on Russia will include not just making Vladimir Putin's regime weaker, but also dismantling it completely. And this will be a long-term thing. Well, and to finalize this, West has two different tracks of assessing Russia and its political reality. One track is what Putin does to Ukraine and on the foreign policy front, and the other thing, what Putin does to his own country. So if it's been clear what Putin does to Ukraine, a war aggressor which breaks the international law, now in what he does to his own country, he's reached this new level where Putin will be just recognized as a politician whose regime should be stopped. What's your take on what Navalny's death could mean to Ukraine and to Russia and the future of our war, Sergei?
I think that Navalny's death actually marks the transition of the Russian state from the authoritarian regime to the totalitarian regime. Before Navalny got into prison, it was a different Russia, different Putin's regime. It actually was quite different from what we see today, because Navalny was poisoned and then he went to Germany. After that, he returned to Russia, hoping that his coming back will strike anti-governmental protests against Putin, but nothing happened. He got in jail, where he spent 3 years, and now he's dead. And of course, Putin doesn't care about if he's toxic or not. Putin has no limitations anymore, and he's solely responsible for the death of his most staunch critic. And right now, the death of Alexei Navalny, I think, wouldn't change anything in Russia, but it will, of course, change the attitude towards Putin's regime in the West. And the death of Navalny is a red flag for everyone, that Putin is actually ready for anything. And President Zelensky said that Putin's regime is solely responsible for this death, hinting that this is a murder. And we all know that that's the way Putin deals with his opponents. Although Alexei Navalny was obviously not Ukraine's friend. He actually supported the occupation of Crimea. He said that Crimea will not be a part of Ukraine, even if he becomes a president of Russia. So he said that this chapter is closed. But after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started, Navalny reconsidered his position, and he said that, of course, Crimea is a part of Ukraine and should be a part of Ukraine, and it is occupied by Russia, and that this should change. He also didn't support the invasion of Ukraine and condemned this invasion. And the Russian regime didn't force Alexei Navalny to say anything that supported the Kremlin narrative, even when Navalny was in jail. And we all know that being in a Russian jail in a totalitarian state like Russia is right now is a huge challenge for anyone. And I think that Navalny was a brave man, and rest in peace, Alexei Navalny. That's what I can
Yeah,
say.
one more thing before we move on to different topics is it's very interesting that Alexei Navalny was anticipating that he might be eventually be killed, and that's why he left a message to his followers so it could be like a political guidance for them at coming stages of their fight against the Putin regime. And the basic philosophy of Navalny on his way of fighting against the totalitarian rule in Russia is that don't be afraid. You can do a lot by doing small things. The usual argument goes, well, if you stand up against Vladimir Putin in Russia, in the best case scenario, you will be arrested. In the worst case scenario, you will lose everything, including your life. But Navalny was making a point that you can do a lot before you're realistically exposed to a risk of being arrested. I mean, you still have a lot of space for activities, for conversations, for communications before you get in problems with the Russian police, Russian prosecutors, and Russian security services. As a leader, of course, he faced much bigger risks than just regular, ordinary followers who regular citizens who may do a lot and use their status of being just normal people, not opinion leaders, not political celebrities. So that's a very important. Do something. Start with small things, and by doing this, you will eventually win over Vladimir Putin and his circle. I think we should remember the Navalny's message, and we'll be happy if those Russians who do understand the nature of Putin's regime will be following this, very important lesson and advice from Navalny.
The only thing that I can say is that after Alexei Navalny's death, Russia will not be the same. I think that those who are ready to protest against this government, they of course may do this, which I doubt will happen. But what will happen, in my opinion, is that those Russians who supported Alexei Navalny and who were against this dictatorship that Putin installed, they will actually leave Russia. And I think that this will weaken the anti-governmental sentiment in Russia even more after the Alexei Navalny's death. Okay, let's talk about the critical situation for Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka, which is the hottest spot on the war map today. As we speak, the Russian army is trying to encircle the Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka. Do you think it's time for the Ukrainian military command to withdraw its troops from the besieged Ukrainian stronghold, Ivan?
I used to be this idealist on Ukraine's strategy for this war, where I would, for almost a year and a half, I would write daily on social media that Ukraine should be aiming at nothing less than getting back to 1991 borders. But finally, I started getting criticism from my followers who would say, well, Ivan, getting the 1991 borders back is a great idea, but this has a cost as we keep losing our soldiers. So when the number of comments of this with this argument grew very substantially, I understood that we can't, be too idealistic on our strategy, and we should take the reality as it is. We know that the number of losses among the Ukrainian troops have likely been growing, which has been reported by the American media, by the Wall Street Journal. And so I think in this dilemma, which is whether you prioritize territories over people, or you prioritize people over territories, I've usually been on the pro-people side for the past 6 months. After the counteroffensive last year didn't prove to be very efficient, and at this stage of the war, it's like the most important political decisions, which include military strategy, are being made by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. While Ukraine's previous commander-in-chief Valery Zaluzhny, he used to value his independent decision-making, Zelensky now has much more impact on how the Ukrainian army fights. Usually, Zelensky has been also on the pro-people side of the dilemma, whether you are ready to sacrifice soldiers' lives for control over territories or you're not. And yesterday, Zelensky reiterated this, saying that keeping Ukrainian soldiers alive is a priority for him. And this is not just, a comment from the president. This is like an order for the Ukrainian generals. So I do expect, and I think that would be right, if Ukrainian army will be sacrificing some piece of territory in Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. And we see this is already happening. So I don't think we should take retreat of Ukrainian troops of some parts of Avdiivka as a tragedy. This is a strategic move, a smart move, which will allow Ukrainian army to keep exhausting the enemy. Well, let me give you just one figure. On February 15th, Russians lost as many as 711 soldiers in that area, in the Avdiivka area. So if we need to fight the war of attrition, which has been recognized as a strategic point by Ukraine's general and chief commander Alexander Syrsky. If we're going to fight the attrition war, well, that's a particularly right move to shift troops to the place where this attrition tactics would pay off more. If we need to move to the east of Avdiivka, well, let's do this. It's not like Avdiivka is a livable place. It used to have 35,000 people of population before the war started, and now like slightly more than 1,000 people still living there, while most of the industrial assets are ruined or damaged. Like Avdiivka is home to this big coking plant, which was important for Ukraine's steel industry. It's too late to fight to protect the town from ruinations. So the only reason that should be underlying all the decision making by Ukrainian generals is in Avdiivka is gaining better tactical position to fight against the Russian army. And I do think that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, well, he doesn't want to allow Russians to have any serious wins before March 17th, when the presidential election, let's take this in parentheses, there's a fakes, of course, when the Russian so-called presidential election is going to take place. Well, Vladimir Putin, he needs a big win to present to his voters on the eve or close to election. And it's like Russians are able to intensify their action in the next 30 days. And Zelensky probably doesn't want that to happen. But I do hope that Volodymyr Zelensky's stance on people versus territories dilemma will be staying on the pro-people side, because, letting hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers die for a kilometer of territory just doesn't make too much sense. And I do hope that this view will be shared by majority of Ukrainian officers and all the people involved in military decision making. So I would conclude with saying that let's not make a tragedy, and let's not call a defeat what the Ukrainian army is doing nowadays in Avdiivka. A small tactical retreat is a sign of how sober and realistic our generals are, which is our strength, not our weakness. And let me ask you this, Serhiy. Uh, do you think the Ukrainian army will be able to get Avdiivka back under this control? When and how this might happen? What's needed for this?
Considering the extremely challenging situation in Avdiivka and along the entire front line right now, I don't see it in the nearest future, at least. I think that the critical shortage of ammunition and military aid from Western allies of Ukraine is starting to show, and the situation in Avdiivka is so bad for Ukrainian forces, so dangerous because of this factor. This is one of the factors that influenced the situation. Russians started their massive onslaught on Avdiivka from several directions 4 months ago, and Ukrainians managed to repel all the attacks. Russians attacked from south of the city, southeast, southwest, northeast, and tried to encircle the Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka. But Ukrainians effectively used kamikaze drones and cluster munitions to stop Russian assaults. And this has been going on for months. And right now, according to the spokes for Ukraine's third separate assault brigade, which was deployed to Avdiivka 10 days ago to reinforce the Ukrainian garrison in this city, Russian troops outnumber Ukrainian forces 7-1 in the Avdiivka sector. And of course, Russians managed to advance. So I think that this is the test for the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, the newly appointed commander-in-chief, Alexander Syrsky, who has to make this difficult decision and withdraw Ukrainian troops. Of course, we don't know the situation in all details. We don't have the full picture. We only can have access to the open source intelligence, and we can see what's going on there with a bit of delay. We don't have like information from the battlefield. The Ukrainians are continuing to fight in the Avdiivka sector. But still, I think it is just a matter of time when Ukrainians will have to withdraw. And this is a bad situation for Ukrainian troops. But of course, the war is won when the army is defeated. And it is not won when 1 or 2 strongholds are captured. So Ukraine will have to withdraw to save lives of its troops and continue to fight. And that's a difficult decision to make. What do you think about it?
Yeah, that's always a difficult decision, especially for general like Syrsky, who is rather would be doing offensive operation. He is, if you'd compare war to like to soccer game, the Syrsky would be playing style with like at least 3 people as strikers. I mean, the attacking style. It's the same style he prefers for warfare. So this psychologically, it might be uncomfortable for Syrsky that his first big operation would be one of a retreat. And let me remind our listeners that Alexander Syrsky in history of Ukraine's military was doing another big retreat in 2015 when he would be organizing and commanding Ukrainian troops who were moving from the northeast of the Donetsk, a much bigger city in the eastern Ukraine, to the territory controlled by the Ukrainian government. It was considered this was a rather very unpleasant situation for the Ukrainian army, which wasn't prepared to fight. To be honest, it didn't have sufficient an amount of weapons, sufficient amount of troops. But still, it's recognized as Syrsky did a pretty good job organizing a retreat in 2015. And for that mission, he received his first big military order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky of third degree. Later, he received 2 more of those orders. as well as Order of Hero of Ukraine. So it's very interesting that in his career, General Sirski's career, like this, really important pages are about organizing missions to help soldiers recruit, which is, in terms of tactics, this should be also very well planned, which involves that logistical lines remain uninterrupted, that the troops retreating from the front part of Ukrainian presence in Avdiivka get backed by supporting troops and supporting reserves, and that the defensive line, which is built, which is hopefully is sustainable to the east of Avdiivka, is prepared to now serve as a front line of our defensive operation in the east. So by probably, I suspect that what we see now, meaning our troops stepping back, could be happening a week ago or 3 days ago or 5 days ago, or even earlier. But the thing is that we took some time, and our army took some time to prepare the defensive line further to the east. It's honestly too late that we've started building the defensive lines. I mean, the thick defensive lines with trenches, where soldiers may live and fight, with the military camps, with mines, landmines, with anti-tank and other defensive infrastructure. But at least we'll get something done in Avdiivka, as well to the north, where the Kharkiv is. Another thick defensive lines being built there, and the Russians may do another advance there too. So in terms of military tactics, this is also a retreat. It's not something you just step back. It's something that needs to be well planned in advance, well executed. And while doing this, you still you can't say Russians, bye, I'm going home. You still have to keep artillery shelling. Then all the fighters doing the firing work, and then another thing is, as you rightly said, Sergei, that Russians have plenty of reserves in eastern Ukraine, and probably they've been thinking about how and where they should put those reserves into use. And now it felt like, I'd compare this to the situation where wolves feel the blood and they become more aggressive. That's how Russians are feeling now in Avdiivka, because they felt that Ukrainian army makes these smallish moves, stepping back, and now they're trying to chase our army. So we see they now increasingly using the phosphorus bombs, and also they are blowing up the coking plant, which has reserves of fuel and gasoline and all kinds of energy substances, the hydrocarbons. They keep Russians put those on fire, producing heavy smoke. So, and they use the black heavy smoke so they wouldn't be noticed by the Ukrainian troops. And so we are not. It's especially gets dangerous during dark part of the day, when you need lots of technology to follow all the enemy's moves, and you need to rotate people to allow some take a rest. So and I'd say we, not only we, wish General Sirski success, and knowing how his logic is, I think that Sirski will make this retreat of Ukrainian army from Avdiivka as slow as possible and as painful for Russians as possible. The only thing I would worry about is how this is going to be viewed by the Ukrainian society, because not all people understand anything in military tactics, and might take this as as a big tragedy. And hopefully, proper work in communicating this move will be done by the communication office of the Ukrainian army, because it's really necessary. Otherwise, Russians will be, happy to offer their version of events, and we should still keep in mind that Russian propaganda will be using the Avdiivka operation heavily in the next weeks. Showing even as small advance as a big victory of Vladimir Putin. So my view is that we shouldn't take this as a strategy, and we should still hope that our army will be able to keep doing defense of their army. We have no other choice, right?
Yes, of course, but during this Avdiivka offensive, Russia sustained huge losses in manpower and military equipment, even according to the open source intelligence analysts' data, who confirm these losses based on video and photo evidence. Russia lost more than 600 armored vehicles and tanks, while Ukraine lost less than 100 armored vehicles and tanks over the past 4 months in the Avdiivka sector. And tactically, Avdiivka is not that important for both sides. Capturing Avdiivka allows the Russian army to control vital roads and the railway to Donetsk, a key logistics hub in eastern Ukraine, which Russia occupied in 2014. Avdiivka is a gateway to Donetsk, but withdrawing Ukrainian troops from Avdiivka wouldn't mean the breakthrough of Russian troops or anything like that. The only thing that will happen is that tube artillery will be able to shell other Ukrainian cities close to the front line. And we know that indiscriminate Russian shelling is something that is happening every day in Ukraine. Russians kill civilians, shelling residential areas with artillery, dropping glide bombs on the Ukrainian cities. And by the way, glide bombs that Russia is using right now to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders in Avdiivka and other parts of the front line is a huge problem for the Ukrainian army. And the only way to deal with this is to target Russian fighter bombers, which operate near the front line, and launch these bombs. So Ukraine desperately needs F-16 fighter jets to deal with that threat. And of course, right now, the situation is critical, and the encirclement looms, and Ukrainians will have to withdraw. But still, the Avdiivka offensive cost a lot to the Russian army. Russia suffered heavy losses, and in this war of attrition, it is an important factor. To exhaust an opponent is very, very important. The Ukrainian garrison in Avdiivka did the best they could to achieve this goal. Okay, let's talk about Russian nukes in space. US intelligence warns that Russia is preparing to put nuclear weapons into orbit. What's going on? Why do you think Russia is planning to do that, Ivan?
I think Russians are trying to revive old Soviet military planning. The war is really intensive. So, and military planning is an important part of how you fight. So while Russians just don't have time to prepare anything original and creative, they go back to old Soviet plans on space exploration. And, since the Cold War era, Soviet space program was like 100% military program. The key goal of while Soviets went into space was whether the spaceships could ever be used as carrying weapons, as part of the military operations against NATO, the West, and the US. And we do remember that when John Kennedy was U.S. president, well, the Soviet spaceships were flying over the U.S. territory, provoking Americans and checking whether Americans had air defense able to hit the objects in the space which are higher than like the skies of the stratosphere. Obviously, Kennedy didn't order his air defense to shoot the Soviet spaceship led back then by astronaut Colonel German Titov. But nowadays, Russians are trying to do the same, and the U.S. intelligence is saying that Russians are preparing a plan to, to use some sort of nuclear weapons in the space orbit. Without going into any details, well, I think this has never been supposed to be publicized, but it got into media after the several people in the U.S. Congress thought of this as a big threat for the whole world, that the Russians would have nukes in the space, and this is how we know about this. So Russians, think of this as like big, scary story, expensive story, get nukes to the space, and they want to show, that they're not scared of NATO and they're prepared for the technological warfare, for more sophisticated, ways to go into this competition on what kind of weapons you have. And what's important is the NATO is doing a big response. I'll give you a figure. This year, NATO will spend a record of $380 billion US dollars on defense. And to understand how big this is, well, in 2014, when there was already a big number of military threats, NATO was spending just $230 billion. And the update of its strategy and its operational capacities that NATO is doing now obviously includes the scenario of whether Russia or any other aggressive state will be using the nuclear weapons. Putin is provoking NATO by doing this, but NATO, it has its space strategy adopted 3 years ago, which is like a newer type of warfare, and now it's working on updating the nuclear response. So it's not like NATO is unprepared for this. NATO is clearly escalating these days. While Russians are saying they will deploy 40,000 of military personnel to the Baltic Sea, directly closer to the NATO countries, NATO is going to deploy twice as much soldiers, most of them Germans. By all the figures, NATO is outplaying Russia easily, having more money, having bigger GDP, having more weapons, having better weapons, we'll likely see that the competition between NATO and Russia will be ongoing. This will be an expensive competition, and NATO's strategy is that Russia will never afford to keep up with all the technological advances that NATO countries may afford. The Silicon Valley with its creativity, engineering culture, with what German manufacturing facilities like Rheinmetall are able of doing, the other companies, and also, what's interesting on this is that we know the Arabic countries are being active on space exploration projects. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they also have done some, ambitions to do work in space, saying they want to do the environmental projects that are like cleaning the space from things flying there. There is garbage in space. They want to do that. And if Russians are going to do any aggressive moves regarding the space projects, this will get Arabic countries who are largely neutral on Ukraine-Russia war on the side of Ukraine. So this indirectly will create more allies for NATO, for Ukraine, and for the Western, alliance to fight the regimes like Vladimir Putin's regime. But before I put a question for you on this, what I want to add is that, like, the rate of losses in personnel that Russia is able to accept would be completely unacceptable by any of the NATO armies. We see well that Russians they have lost over 400,000 soldiers so far in Ukraine by official estimates. None of the NATO countries would fight the war in this way, while we see that mobilizing more people into NATO armies, which are not in a direct big war, anywhere in this world is not popular. Germans don't really want to serve to do mandatory service in the army. Unlike, according to a poll I have, only 17% of Germans would take up arms if Germany goes for war. British generals announced mobilization. It's not popular in Britain. It's been criticized by the Financial Times as, no one wants to serve in the army, even in the reserves. Same problems in South Korea. People criticizing need to serve in the army. So big problem for NATO is how to get more people serving into the army after Russia escalates, whether through any of the innovative warfare like space projects or traditional warfare like putting troops on the NATO borders. And my question for you would be, do you think that Russia is realistically and technically able to deliver nukes to the space, and what could trigger Russian, nuclear aggression, including this highly worrying space project?
Actually, I know little about the technical part of this move. The only thing I can say is that the Russian move is not about dropping nuclear weapons on Earth, in my opinion, but it is rather about possible use of nukes against satellites orbiting the planet. I don't know if they can technically launch nuclear weapons into space and use them there, damaging the satellites. But if it is possible, this is a grave threat for the security of the United States, the West, Ukraine, because especially for Ukraine, because the Ukrainian army heavily relies on Starlink terminals, which they use to distribute Wi-Fi signal to the drones. And considering that Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, artillery shells, and the US aid is stalled, drones is probably the only thing that stops Russia from advancing any further right now. And if Russians manage to damage Starlink satellites with a nuclear explosion in space, and Ukrainians lose this capability, lose the opportunity to use drones, which are not effective without the internet. So this will actually influence the situation on the front line. But I'm not sure that the Russians will do that or are able to do anything like that. I think that probably this move is a part of the nuclear blackmail that Russia has been using for years, and exploiting the fear of a nuclear escalation that we all have, and that the Western society has when it comes to conflict with Russia. And I'm not sure that Russians will actually launch nuclear weapons into space, but what they can do is using this possible move as a leverage to force the United States to stop the military aid to Ukraine permanently, to show the readiness of Russia to escalate the conflict, and to actually globalize the war in Ukraine. This is what Russia is doing, I think, with this move. But it is hard to say. We know little about the technical part of it.
On technical part, I would add just a small observation I have. We know that Elon Musk has been running the SpaceX company that launches rockets into the space, and it's a multi-billion company that invests a lot in terms of money and and brains into what kind of rockets they produce to sell to NASA, to the American Space Agency. And still, like a big number of those rockets, they explode, despite having like the best technology, having best engineering, finding solutions on how you fly into the space. Well, now given that even like the best engineers in California aren't able to deliver anything that would be 100% safe while flying in the space, well, what we can expect in Russia, where investment into science has been severely cut this year, investment into research and development has been severely cut, as Russians have to spend the 30% of their budget on funding the army that invades Ukraine. well, they might try to deliver anything with nukes and containing the nuclear exploding mechanism to the space, but there is no guarantees that it might explode while going there. I mean, I have no trust for the technological solutions that Russian engineers would be using in this case. Well, look at Russian drones, right? Um, uh, of course, they explode, but they are not precise. I mean, even during the latest hit that Russians did around Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities, well, most were not reaching. Well, those were missiles, right? But those were still mostly missing their targets. So the same with the drones. Russians have lots of drones, lots of cheap drones, which is is rather their strength of their drone program. But in terms of their technical capability, of course, they are worse than the drones that the US Army has, which are though a lot more expensive. So I think if Russia makes even an attempt to do anything with nukes, I'm sure it has an obsolete technology, and I'm sure Russians will have much more problems with executing any of the nuclear moves than they expect they might have. And by even having a plan of using nukes in any way, whether against satellites, which probably shouldn't have any human cost, but we don't know yet, how the nuclear explosion is taking place in the space. I mean, just by having a plan of doing this is quite a substantial escalation. And just remember that, the US and Russia were supposed to renew the agreement on nuclear non-proliferation and non-proliferation of long-range missiles. An agreement has been signed. So Russians are showing like, come on, guys, we haven't signed an agreement, and we're not going to have plans for more nuclear projects. This will definitely be taken as a big escalation by the NATO, which will have to match own nuclear prevention capacity, while also, this will lead to more military trainings with NATO troops on nuclear prevention and response. So it's not that Russians are in any way getting into a better military, strategic, or geopolitical position by having plans on using nukes against satellites. But also, this tells a story how much Russians are worrying about the depth and quality of intelligence that NATO has from the satellites that are, screening the situation from the space. That's important because with all things happening in Russia being pretty clear to satellites of NATO countries, well, of course, Russia can't do anything unexpected, and that's was the reason why we basically knew when the war would start in Ukraine. I mean, to February 2022. That's particularly, we have to be grateful to those satellites in space that Russia now wants to hit. Sergei, do you think that Russian engineering is good enough to produce solutions, whether for nukes or for satellites or for drones or for aircraft or for anything that we should worry about?
I don't know about that. I'm not an expert in that field, but what I do know is that Russia lags behind the West, of course, but Russia is still capable of producing high-tech weapons. We can see it on the battlefield in Ukraine. Of course, they're using Western components to do that, but still they have this intellectual potential to produce weapons like that. The space industry is degrading. But they are still capable of launching satellites into space. This is a powerful space country, Russia. So I wouldn't underestimate their abilities. And of course, I think that this move with nuclear weapons in space is another indication that the longer the war in Ukraine continues, the more Russia is inclined to globalize the conflict, to distract the West from helping Ukraine, and I think this is a part of this plan. And speaking about the military support for Ukraine, House Speaker Mike Johnson blocks the Ukraine aid bill. Is Ukraine losing bipartisan support in the United States? And is there a chance that the Ukraine aid bill will be passed in the near future? What do you think about it?
Unfortunately, I do think that Ukraine has lost a bipartisan consensus in the US that it's been having for more than 30 years, right? Since Ukraine became independent in 1991, all the ambassadors of America to Ukraine, all the American presidents, all the secretaries of states would, reassure us each year and each political season that we have the bipartisan consensus and bipartisan support. This was taken for granted. Like we here in Ukraine, we didn't even think that it could be different, especially in such matters as fighting a war against Russia. But what we see is that Republicans have changed how they view Ukraine. Well, the biggest surprise is that Senator Lindsey Graham voted against the Ukraine funding bill in the Senate, though previously he was one of the biggest advocates of helping Ukraine. And he, the problem is that he is one of the most experienced and most influential politicians in the Republican Party. And that means that he may, involve other Republicans, more junior ones, into supporting this position. So it's like while previously most American politicians in the Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, would support winning at any cost, winning the war against Russia at any cost. Now there is a substantial group of Republicans of pro-Trump line who support ending the war at any cost. Now, I'd like to quote Mike Lee, his Republican senator for Utah, a very conservative state. He tweeted this phrase, I'm quoting, prolonging this war doesn't help the people of Ukraine. So it's like it tells you their arguments. Why do you need the territories, right? You need people to be healthy and alive. Just stop the war, stop fighting. The problem is with the Republican Party, with other people supporting such views and ending the war right now, like Ted Cruz, who is, well, you can't call him, irrational. Ted Cruz has always been, this conservative rational. He's from Texas, lobbyist of the oil industry, a very conventional politician, and still he voted against the Ukraine bill. Um, Marco Rubio, another big and important person in the Republican Party, who even used to have presidential ambitions, same thing. So I think the logic behind the Republican Party is that, well, in its roots, right, it's the voice of the American corporate sector. And for American corporate sector, war is painful for its spillovers, which are disruptions in supply chains. And the second thing is inflation, which leads to higher interest rates and more expensive loans that they need for their businesses. And they while using this monetary logic, economic logic, in their best interest, in the interest of their companies that might do funding for the Republican Party, it's in their interest to end the war tomorrow. Ukrainian territories are not a priority for people like Ted Cruz or Senator Lindsey Graham, right? Unfortunately. And what I would argue? Well, I would like to tell that Mike Lee, senator for Utah, if Russians would take away 20% of territory of Utah, would you still be saying that Utah doesn't need to fight because it doesn't help people in Utah? Right? It's easy to make this decision so that Ukraine should trade territories when you live in a big democracy protected by a strong, huge military system. But it's much harder for us here in Ukraine because you give Russians 1 meter of your land and they grab 10 kilometers of this land. If this wouldn't be so, well, we are not naive in Ukraine, right? We're not dumb. We don't want to die here. We want to live. We want to be healthy, and we want our soldiers to live and be healthy. The reason why we're fighting is because we think it's the best way to end this war. And the best way to end this war is to defeat the Russian army in any of the possible ways, in any of the possible, dateline schedules and military planning. Of course, we want the war to be over tomorrow, and we want it to be won, but it's not realistic plan. So we are fighting, and the more we have been helped, the likelier we're going to end this war end this war in the West and Ukraine's and NATO's and America's best interest. And I hope that what's now happening in the Republican Party is just the worst period of their history. I hope that after Trump loses the presidential election, well, that's a little bit of forecasting from my side, that the Republican Party will reestablish itself and will reemerge to, those high political and ethical standards that were shown by U.S. President Ronald Reagan in the 80s, who would, be so consistent on his anti-Soviet policy, and also the late Senator John McCain, who is, we have a street of John McCain in Kyiv. He's a really big and important symbol of how American politics, conservative politics should be to us here in Ukraine. That's how we understand the ideology of Republican Party from people like John McCain. And while we see what Mike Johnson's doing in the House, well, that's not the Republican Party that we're used to. That looks like Republican Party is having this big disease that it needs to get treatment for. And do you think that, Serhiy, that losing this bipartisan consensus is tragic and a huge loss and will be defining line for Ukraine's future, or still we will be able to define without support of this big number of Republicans?
I think that it is extremely important for Ukraine to secure the U.S. military support, because let's be honest, the United States is the biggest military power in the world. So European countries are not able to compensate for the loss of that support, and Ukraine is fighting against one of the biggest armies in the world. So Russia is actually the second largest army in the world. So we desperately need that support, and being in the middle of a genocidal invasion is not that pleasant, to put it mildly. And to be in the middle of it is to have another perspective. And so we know perfectly well as Ukrainians that this is a genocidal invasion. The aim of the Russian state is to occupy the entire territory of Ukraine, to erase the Ukrainian national identity, culture, language. We see what's going on the occupied territories of Ukraine. We see how many people are being tortured, killed, and how many people are forced to leave their homes. We see the abduction of Ukrainian kids, the deportation of children to Russia. We see the ban of Ukrainian language in the occupied territories. So we see that. We can actually prove that this is happening. We can actually see what happened on the territories that were liberated from the Russian occupation. The Ukrainian police found numerous graves of Ukrainian civilians who were killed with their hands tied behind their back. We saw that in Izum in the Kharkiv Oblast in eastern Ukraine. We saw that in Bucha, north of Kyiv, in the beginning of the Russian invasion. We know what will happen to Ukraine if Russia manages to occupy the entire territory of Ukraine. And without the American aid, Ukraine will, of course, become weaker, and its ability to repel the Russian invasion will degrade. So this means that Russia will occupy more land and more people will suffer. More Ukrainians will be killed, tortured, deported. More Ukrainians will lose their homes, because we know how Russia wages the war. They shell the residential areas, bomb civilians all the time, every day. We see casualties among civilians. And so Russians raise Ukrainian cities to the ground. Many cities are lying in ruins. Mariupol in the Donetsk region, which is now occupied, is totally destroyed. Before the invasion, more than 500,000 people lived in Mariupol, and now it's only 120,000. And many cities like that are also lying in ruins, like Popasna in the Donetsk region. and Bakhmut. Now Avdiivka is being demolished, and 32,000 people lived in Avdiivka before Russia started the invasion. Now we have less than 1,000 people staying there, and they have no even an opportunity to evacuate because of the heavy fighting that is going on right now. So, and the position of Mike Johnson and the Republican Party, it endangers a sovereign democratic state, a U.S. ally, and they are throwing Ukraine under the bus. And I want to believe that the position of Mike Johnson doesn't reflect the position of the entire Republican Party, and we still have this bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress. And there is still a procedural opportunity to put the Ukraine aid bill to a vote in the House of Representatives without the participation of the Speaker, who is blocking it. And this procedure is called a discharge petition. It allows lawmakers to force legislation to the floor if they can gather the signatures of a majority of the House of Representatives, 218 members, calling for the action. And many Republicans in the House, including the leaders of the Foreign Affairs, Armed Services, and Intelligence Committees, have supported the Ukraine aid, but it is unclear how many of them are willing to team up with the Democrats to force this discharge petition. And those of our listeners who are familiar with these procedural issues in the US Congress, please write what you think about these nuances in the comments section below this podcast. I can only quote some provisions from this procedure. Okay, so after a bill has been introduced and referred to committee for 30 legislative days or more, any member may file a motion with the clerk of the House to discharge the committee from further consideration of the bill. A member may also file a motion to discharge the Rules Committee from consideration of a special rule after the rule has been pending before the Rules Committee for at least 7 legislative days and the bill has been reported by a standing committee or has been referred to a standing committee for 30 legislative days. Discharge petitions may cover only a single introduced measure, not multiple bills. So what that means is if this procedure comes to life, if the congressmen in the House manage to activate the discharge petition, what it means for the Ukraine aid bill is that it will still be there in the House for another 30 days, as far as I understand. So this is no good for Ukraine. And we see that Ukraine is suffering from the lack of ammunition right now, and Ukrainian troops are losing their ground. And so I really hope that we are not on the verge of losing a bipartisan support from both Democrats and Republicans. But we also see that Donald Trump uses the issue of Ukraine aid in his presidential campaign. And Donald Trump obviously influences the position of Mike Johnson. And what Donald Trump is trying to achieve, I think, is to cut off this military support of Ukraine, to weaken the position of Ukraine, and to allow any negotiations between the United States and Russia on the Ukrainian issue when Donald Trump returns to the White House. So if Donald Trump returns to the White House and wins the presidential elections, it will probably mean that the Republican Party would support their president and that Ukraine will lose their bipartisan support. But right now, I don't see it that way. I think that both the Republicans and the Democrats will vote for the Ukraine aid bill if the House Speaker allows them to do that. But I don't see it happening soon. How do you think? Do we still have a chance to have that support from the United States, or it's over for Ukraine already?
Well, let me answer this way. If I'd be Ukraine's finance minister, I wouldn't count on getting this money for the next 3 months. I would plan my budget and budget for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian army without 60 billion bucks that we are supposed to get from them, from the United States. It may come as a surprise, and then it would be good news, but I wouldn't count on it for the next 3 months. And it's still the Republicans have issue with oversight. How Ukrainian military spending is being done, whether it has corruption, whether it doesn't have a corruption. So I think that there's some, even if it's going to be eventually approved, it might get like broken into parts, which could be like some sort of compromise between Republicans and Democrats, where Republicans would say, well, guys, come on, okay, we'll vote, but it's not going to be 60 billion, it's going to be like 15 billion, and then we'll see how it's going to be spent. Well, but still, 60 billion is pretty big money for Ukraine. Our whole fiscal budget is 40 billion bucks. That's all our economy may pay in taxes, and even probably less than that. So of course, $60 billion is like, is more than what our whole economy pays in taxes. But for American economy, U.S. borrows trillion bucks each quarter through selling treasuries, bonds. And then I just remember 2008 when the President George Bush Jr. Was bailing out the American banks after the global financial crisis. He requested $700 billion from the US Congress to save banks, to put capital into banks. Now think of this, $700 billion on saving banks and $60 billion on saving millions of Ukrainians. I mean, banks are more expensive, while these are people lives. So it's surprising for Ukrainians, and I think that someday Mike Johnson will be thinking of this period of his political career as a big failure, when he is being Scrooge McDuck on such an issue as lives of Ukrainian soldiers and of Ukrainian people. In Ukraine, Mike Johnson is seen as a person who is fine with war being fought far away from where he is, as long as he is doing his political mission that he's been guided by his supervisors like Donald Trump. So I think we'll get something from America, maybe less than we want to, maybe later than we want to. But I think American democracy is still healthy enough to do financial assistance for Ukraine. It's having hard times, but it's still a working democracy that will maybe fixed and eventually will be fixed.
Yes, of course, by undermining the support to Ukraine, Republicans must be aware of the fact that they are helping Russia. And if Russia wins this war, occupies Ukraine and becomes stronger and uses the demographic, intellectual, economic potential of Ukraine to globalize the confrontation with the West, to threaten the security of Europe, which is the biggest market for the United States, this will not serve good for the American society. And what Mr. Johnson is doing is endangering the United States, and he's going against the national interests of the United States by undermining the Ukrainian military support. But let's hope that the common sense will prevail and Ukraine will get the support anyways. Ukraine will keep fighting, and even without it. Ukrainians won the Battle of Kyiv without almost anything, any weapons from the West, except Stingers and Javelins, anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. So Ukrainians are capable of fighting, but we should be aware of the fact that Russia is a huge country with a huge military potential and resources that they are using to conquer Ukraine. And they actually invest much more into this invasion than the United States are ready to offer to support Ukraine. So Ukraine is a small country and it needs support. If Ukraine loses, the security of the European continent will be undermined. So we can only hope that Mike Johnson will change his position and Donald Trump will change his position on Ukraine either. Okay, let's wrap it up. It's been like more than an hour already. Our listeners may be tired of our long conversation. So feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel, to Euromaidan Press social media accounts, and don't forget to subscribe to Ivan Verstyuk's social media accounts. You will find a lot of interesting stuff there too. And see you next week. Be safe.
Bye.
Bye.